let disabled people lead. If you have questions about disabled issues, ask a disabled person. And not every disabled person is going to tell you the same thing.
Laura, welcome to Empathy Led. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
Of course, thank you for accepting the invitation. I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
So am I.
So, for those who do not know you, what are some of the pieces of your life puzzle that are important enough for us to have in order to have an understanding of who you are and the path that led you here?
I think the first one is to know that I was born with a condition called osteogenesis imperfecta, which more commonly is called brittle bone disease. I like to say it does what it says on the tin, which just means that my bones are much more fragile than the average person. There are multiple types of OI, ranging from very mild to very severe. I fall somewhere in the middle. So, what that means is that a good portion of my childhood was spent in doctor's offices and in hospitals. I had 10 major surgeries between the ages of 4 and 15. Um, I also have scoliosis, which means that starting at the age of 7, I wore a full back brace for, I mean, what's like 16 hours a day. I had to wear it except when I was asleep. I had my first spinal fusion when I was 11, and then I had to have a second one when I was 14. So that was fun because, now with 3D printing, back braces are actually quite thin and very comfortable, and mine were not.
Mm.
They were really thick plastic, very uncomfortable. I got compared to looking like a football player more than once, which is not a great feeling when you're, a preteen girl. So I do use a wheelchair. Not everyone with OI uses a wheelchair. Let's see. I think that's the biggest thing to know. I grew up. I mean, everybody would be like, "Well, your life is not normal because you spent so much time in the hospital and all that." But my childhood was as normal as it could be, given the situation. I have one sister who I adore, and she would probably hate me saying that, but I don't care. Uh, she's probably like, "Get some friends, Laura." I grew up with both parents. I grew up with grandparents, an extended family. I have always loved being creative. I'm very artistic. I love to read. So, you know, it it took me a long time to kind of figure out what I wanted to do. But disability advocacy has always kind of been in the back of my mind. I took an opportunity right out of college to write for the Charlotte Observer. They used to have a program called the Community Columnist, where for a year you could write a monthly column pretty much on anything you wanted. So I wrote about a lot of disability issues, which, you know, only having 12 columns, you only have those 12 chances to bring up important issues. And so I did get a lot of feedback that I was bitter because, I was like trying to bring attention to these problems, but I really didn't care because I kind of figured I sort of went by the motto like you're not doing it right if you're not pissing somebody off. So that's always been important to me, and it took me a while to figure out how I wanted to continue that. I tried to blog a few times, and it didn't really work. But in 2020, I discovered podcast, and I started to listen to a podcast, and I was like, well, I could do this. So I was like, oh, I wonder if anybody would listen to me. And and then in 2021, I launched Bad Attitudes, an uninspiring podcast about disability to sort of, if you look at typical media portrayal of disability, it's very inspirational. it's very saccharine, I think is a good word. It's not realistic. It's very much made for the non-disabled gaze. And I knew I was frustrated by it. I knew other disabled people were frustrated by it. So I wanted to create something that gave people more of an outlet and more of an insight into what it realistically means to be disabled in the 21st century. So I started my podcast and here I am.
Yeah, yeah, no, I love it. I love it. So I know you have an entire podcast dedicated to what it realistically means to be disabled. But for
Mhm.
the sake of this conversation and somebody listening, like what is the abbreviated version of that? For somebody to have a basic understanding of the gap that exists between the way disabled people are portrayed and what it is realistically to be disabled.
I think the first thing I would say is that I often remind people disability is not a tragedy. Um, there can be tragic circumstances surrounding how someone becomes disabled, an accident, an illness, something. Uh, but disability in and of itself is value neutral. It's not good or bad. It just is a way people exist. And I think a lot of non-disabled people, they see someone who's disabled, um, or they meet someone who has an invisible disability and they learn all these things and they're like, oh my God, that sounds horrible. I could never. Um, so I think that's the first thing is that disability is not a tragedy. The second thing is disabled people are not here to lift non-disabled people up. Um, I know you were there at the TED Talk and you heard how much I said about inspiration porn, which is, this idea that disabled people are inherently inspirational, essentially for getting out of bed in the morning. And that's just not it. I mean, disabled people are first and foremost people. And I think we forget that, it's very much when we talk about disabled people, we're saying, oh, look, they did this thing that is not that hard to do, but because they're disabled, we should celebrate it. And most disabled people don't want that. They don't want you to be like, "Oh, you're so inspirational." Like just we mostly just want you to let us live our lives. And
Yeah,
if we do something inspirational, that's great. Praise us for that. Um, Acknowledge that, but don't make it that, oh, you didn't kill yourself today, so that's very inspirational.
no. Yeah, no, I mean the TEDx, the TED talk that you referred to was so eye opening and enlightening for me. I really love your tone, especially. I feel like the level of humor and sarcasm that you bring to bringing light to these issues that at times feel super heavy,
Hmm.
really makes it accessible for people that otherwise might feel uncomfortable having these conversations.
I mean, I've always been sarcastic. I've always been very like humor led. Um, and I think you'll find that a lot of disabled people have a kind of gallows humor. Um, because I mean, we go through a lot of dark, heavy stuff, and you know, and it's that saying, if you don't laugh, you'll cry, kind of
Mm,
thing. And I think it helps people if I lead with humor, and they know it's okay to laugh. It becomes more humanizing. It
yeah.
they see me more as a person than as some sort of figurehead for disability.
Yeah, no, no, I completely agree. I completely agree, and your delivery is so good. Is you have this
Thank you.
almost the delivery of a comedian, where the timing of the puns is so good. I want to talk. I want to touch a little bit on your childhood. In many
Okay.
ways, you said you felt your childhood was was a normal childhood given your circumstances. You know, your disability was just another way for you to exist. But I want to have an understanding of how that particular childhood and those particular circumstances have shaped and influenced maybe your interests, have shaped and influenced your worldview, and the things that you you have grown, um, you've developed a passion for.
I mean, one thing to know, for me specifically, but also I think for a lot of people who grew up disabled, is that we do tend to spend a lot of time alone. You know, I know there were two instances I was in a full body cast, which means from chest to toes, full plaster body cast. This was the 80s. It was hot. It was heavy. It was not fun. But I couldn't go to school. I couldn't. I had friends who would come over, but at the same time, they physically, even body cast notwithstanding, physically had a lot more freedom than I did. They could go out and ride a bike. They could, do, the typical free range 80s kids kind of stuff that I could not do. And so, yeah, I did spend a lot of time on my own, which I think helped develop my creativity. It certainly developed my imagination, which at times can be quite overactive. Um, I mentioned, I loved reading. Books were really a source of pleasure for me. They still are. Like most kids would get excited to go to the toy store, which I also did get excited to go to the toy store. But like, take me to a bookstore, forget about it. Like, just let me go. So I think you know being it also, I'm very introverted naturally. Like, I recharge by being alone, and it takes more energy for me to be very social or be out and among people. I think that was probably influenced by the fact that I just naturally spent more time on my own, without peers. But I think positively, it really helped me develop empathy for other marginalized groups. Like, like racism has never made sense to me. Homophobia has never made sense to me. Um, because I'm like, no, I know what it feels like to be different. I know what it feels like to be isolated because you're different. So it very much from a very young age, I was just like very aware of when other people were treated differently, and that didn't sit right with me. And I still feel very empathetic towards those sort of causes. And I think some people see it as virtue signaling. Um, but it's a genuine, like, I can't imagine, you know, I have friends who are on the spectrum of being transgender, they're non-binary, or they have a kid who's trans, and I see all these legislations coming out, and it's just hate legislation. And I'm like, and I see the parallels between the way the government and certain parties treat people who are different, people who are in the trans community or in the LGBT community. Um, and I'm like, they're coming for us. They're coming for the disabled people next. Like, you have to be aware of that, because a lot of people, a lot of other disabled creators made a thing about the new when they made those bans on being in drag in public. They're very much like the so-called ugly laws that were in the U.S. From the late 1800s up until 1974. And the ugly laws made it functionally illegal to be disabled in public.
Wow.
Like, if you looked different, if you could cause fear among the normal people, you could be arrested. And it's I don't think people understand the correlation of how all marginalized groups are intertwined. You know, it's there's always I always point out that um being disabled is the only marginalized group you are not born into, or you don't have to be born into. You can be, but you don't have to be. And it's the only marginalized group that crosses all boundaries. And it just growing up disabled really made me aware of how people who are different are treated and why they're treated differently.
I mean, I am always so fascinated by all the ways in which our childhood and our upbringing really shape and influence the people that we become. And in many, many ways, whatever we consider to be a strength or a superpower of ours usually finds its origin from that childhood, right? Like I can
Hmm.
hear how spending a lot of time on your own, and you said it yourself, has just stimulated your curiosity, has enabled
Hmm.
the level of deep introspection that leads to self-awareness, that also leads to empathy, right? All
Yeah.
these qualities that we know are super important, in order for us to be able to interact with the world around us, and in order for us to be able to connect with other human beings. I always
Right.
say, and I feel like I bring it up at least once every episode, that the starting point to empathy is self-awareness. That when you
Hmm.
empathize with someone, what you are really doing is that you are recognizing and seeing yourself, your shared humanity in that person, even when the experience doesn't exactly mirror yours, right? um,
Exactly.
and there is something powerful about that, that I think, for me, in retrospect, a lot of the time I attribute this, at least this fascination and curiosity with empathy, with being a middle child between two
Mm.
sisters, and growing up essentially with my mom and my two sisters following my parents divorced, right? Like I was raised by
Right.
women, and I think that that experience really influenced the way I see the world. That at times is slightly different from maybe a boy who grew up in a household with four brothers.
Right.
Right. So I'm always so fascinated. So you talk a lot about media's portrayal of disabled people. I
Hmm.
want to get from your perspective your assessment of, marketing's portrayal of disabled people, right? Like I run a branding and marketing agency. Part of why this podcast exists was to really, um, help myself, my agency, but also the people who listen to this really be exposed to different point of view, different life experiences, so that together we can really flex our empathy muscle, and
Hmm.
begin to do marketing in a way that is truly reflective of how people live and who people are, what their wants, their
Right.
needs, their fears, their aspirations are. Because I think that's the seed of great marketing. So from that same assessment of how the media portrayal, like what is your assessment of how, disabled people are portrayed in various marketing campaigns and spots and advertising?
I mean, my gut reaction is to go, they they show disabled people in marketing. I mean, it is more common now, obviously. Um, but I think it says a lot when I say I get excited if I see a TV commercial that for a brief second shows a disabled person. Like, I mean, literally a split second. And I'm like, oh, there's one of us, sort of. I know, for example, there's this Peloton commercial And like I don't care about Peloton. Like I don't care. But I was watching it and I looked at it and I was like, did that guy have a prosthetic leg? And so like it took me a couple of watches, but every time it came on, I would like laser hone in. And yeah, the guy had a prosthetic leg. And they didn't make a big deal out of it. They didn't highlight it, but it was there. And I was like, I was excited by it because even though we have, for example, we have disabled sports, we have the Paralympics, people don't make that corresponding connection that, oh, disabled people can be athletic, And so it's those little things that are exciting to me. So, I know Target did an ad campaign not too long ago. I mean, maybe a couple of years ago, where they featured kids with disabilities, which was really cool because I didn't see that growing up. Like, I was not the only the only representation I remember from my childhood. I don't know. Do you remember the show Different Strokes?
Yeah.
Okay, so for a few episodes, there was a girl called Kathy, and she actually had OI. She had the same condition I have, but she was so, and I didn't realize it until much later in life, but she was so very much the avatar for what non-disabled people seem to want disabled people to be,
Mm.
which is super sweet, very like angelic and cherubic, and these things that I'm not. Maybe I was when I was a kid, but I'm certainly not now. Um, and it was just, it was very sort of stock of what non disabled people expected from a disabled kid, you know? So I think for marketing, I like it when they don't make a big deal out of it. You know what I mean? Like you don't have to draw attention to the fact that the guy on the Peloton bike has a prosthetic leg. Like people will notice. It might take them a few times to really kind of like hone in on it, but they'll notice. And it doesn't have to be a big deal. I know when Kim Kardashian released her adaptive clothing line, and Candace Owens made such a stink about how I don't want to see a disabled person wearing underwear. Like, what do you think we wear? Like, I mean, do you don't think disabled people wear clothes? Like, it wasn't even. It was so innocuous and it was so basic, and also it was advertising to the demographic of disabled people. Like, these were the people who were going to be buying these clothes, and it just I don't I don't know. It's the same people who get in a big stink when you see an interracial couple or a gay couple in a commercial with kids, like, oh, the indoctrination. And I just but I appreciate when companies don't make a big deal about it. It's just a thing that is,
Yeah.
because you don't have to make a big deal about it for it to be impactful.
Yeah. No, I love that. I love that. I think the not making a big deal out of it very much sounds like steering away from the inspiration porn that you talk about. That
Hmm.
is the norm, right? Like, we're gonna make a big
Right.
deal out of that so that people can see, look at us, we're not like those other companies.
Yeah.
We care, instead of just showing another version of the human experience, another slice of the human experience that exists, and that is just as valid and just as real as any other
Right.
version of reality and any other version of the human experience. And I think it's in that variety that we truly are able to realize that we really have a shared human experience.
Mhm.
Like whenever I talk to people that grew up in America, for example, they are always, not always, a lot of the times they are so surprised to see and to hear how similar our childhoods were in the things that we did and the way that we played, and the why it's like, no, 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 we all live the same lives. And I think social media at times is such a good tool for us to recognize that, because somebody will create
Mhm.
a meme or somebody will write something, you're like, oh my god, like we are all of us are living the exact
Yep.
same life. Right, like I
Yep.
do that too, I have that too, and is I think it is in those, and that's why I think art and these little things feel so sometimes way more powerful in cutting through the collective consciousness than any of the big gestures or the big laws, or the things that we
Right.
do with those little, those little memes and little avatars and little jokes that we have that
Yeah.
really help us recognize in each other this shared experience that we all have.
It's that feeling of like, oh, I'm not the only one that feels this way. Oh, I'm
Yeah.
not the only one who's going through. It's that thing we all need when we're teenagers and we're just so in our own heads, and we're just like, no, nobody knows how I feel.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. So I know you took all that imagination, all that creativity, all that love for art and design, and you turned it into a business. And you are very much an entrepreneur in your own right. Can you tell us a little bit about your business venture, and what was really the origin story of that journey?
Well, like I said, I've always been very creative, very artistic. I drew all the time when I was a kid, coloring book, like whatever. I would do it all. Um, and eventually, all the stuff I made started to take up a whole lot of room. So I was like, I got to get rid of some of this stuff, But as an artist, you're attached to it. You don't want to like get rid of it. You don't want to throw it away. So initially, I started. So I went through many iterations of being a entrepreneur, freelancer. At first I thought I was gonna be the next Lois Lane. Like I wanted to be Lois Lane, and then I realized, nope. I just want Superman. I really don't want to write for a newspaper. Um, I had that realization. And then I got a degree in English, and everybody's like, "Oh, you're gonna be a teacher," and I'm like, not for all the money in every single world that exists. Never going to be a teacher. I do not have the patience. I do not have the inclination. My mom and my sister, my mom actually just retired from being a teacher. My sister's a teacher. And I'm like, no way in hell. No way. Um, so I had an English degree. So I thought, okay, maybe I'll do this. But a thing I really loved as a teenager was designing websites. I actually
Mm.
learned how to write code when I was 16. I taught myself how to write code. So for a while, I was like, okay, I'm going to be a website designer. Yeah, I mean, I did it for a little bit and it wasn't the right fit. And so eventually I was like, what's the thing I've always loved? What's always brought me joy? Um, you know, what have people always responded to? And that's, my art, my being an illustrator. And so I opened an Etsy store. And I won't lie, it's tough because there's so much competition on Etsy. And if you can't get found on Etsy, like nothing is going to save you. So it's been a constant struggle, but it's been totally worth it because I finally like I finally feel like I'm doing what I should have been doing the whole time. Like whenever people are like, "What would you do if you could go back in time and tell yourself XYZ. I'd be like, well, first of all, take some more art classes. Give up. Don't worry about being Lois Lane. Give that up. Maybe take some business classes. Although I don't know, the business world has like changed so drastically, so quickly that I'm not sure business classes that I would have taken in college would even be relevant now.
Nah.
Um, yeah, I'm like, I just watch it on YouTube. Um, so so then, so I started an Etsy store, and it was sort of a side project. It wasn't really my main focus at first, but then I was like, I should lean into this. I should lean into this more. So then I was like, okay, I'm going to rebrand. I'm going to change the name to Fairy Nerdy because I love
Which I
fairies
love,
and I'm a
by the
huge
way. I want
nerd.
you to tell us about more about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's really simple. I love fairies and I'm a huge nerd. Like, I mean, that's everybody's like, what's this? I'm like, that's the big secret. I'm a huge nerd. I love, and that's the thing. Like, a lot of what I make is inspired by stuff I love. So like I love Doctor Who so much. And actually recently they got a new showrunner who was a previous showrunner, and he has made promises to really lean into the disabled community and bring more disabled representation into Doctor Who, which he has done already. He has made the TARDIS, the police box, he has made it wheelchair accessible on the show. Like it's canon. And like that's such a huge thing for someone like me who watches the show, loves the show, and has always felt like a part of the show, but also slightly separated. Just just enough to like, and now it's suddenly like, no, hey, come in. You can travel through time and space too. And that's so huge. And I made a big deal about it in my own podcast. I actually did 2 episodes about it because I was so excited. And I made stuff for my Fairy Nerdy store because I love the worlds of fantasy and science fiction. I mean, because it's so inclusive.
Hmm.
Like, like I said before, I read a lot, and like I don't really read contemporary fiction. I'm much more onto the fantasy end because it's much more inclusive. I mean, you can find contemporary
Go
books that
deeper.
include
Go deeper
disabled
in that, please.
characters.
Like, go deeper in that idea of the fantasy world is much more inclusive.
Well, I mean, you know, I mean, okay, I'm going to go back to Doctor Who. Like it just makes sense when you're talking about a show that is based in science fiction that of course, a time traveling spaceship would be accessible. Like why wouldn't it be? Like here's this advanced civilization who has created this thing that can travel literally through time and space. Why wouldn't it be? It's so it's so I don't know. I'm having a hard time putting it into words. um the fantasy world, it's because anything can happen.
Yeah.
You're not limited to what people see as reality. Um, and I say it that way specifically, for a reason. Like it's what people see as reality. Um, my reality is different than what people perceive my reality to be. And so like of course it makes perfect sense that I could travel the universe with the doctor.
Yeah.
Why not? And I think that's so important to people. And I saw a lot. There is a faction of the fandom that can be very toxic. Because Doctor Who's been around since 1963. It just celebrated its 60th anniversary. Like it's been around forever in terms of a TV show. And so there are a lot of people who are like, I don't want it to change. I want it to stay the same. And they didn't like when they made the doctor a woman, and now we've got the first black doctor, the first openly queer doctor. Like, and it's huge. It's huge to do that, to represent these minority groups, because we consume this media too. It's not just old white men watching Doctor Who. Um, part of what I do with Fairy Nerdy, I do a lot of selling in person. So I try to do like a lot of cons, so a lot of Comic Con type stuff, and
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know, like that environment is always so welcoming. And and I'm not unaware of the fact that there are issues like within the environment, within fandoms, specifically. Um, but generally speaking, the environments that I've been in that cater to the nerds, the geeks, the outcasts, they're so welcoming and they're so inclusive. And like you will see disabled people and you will see queer people and you will see people of color. And and we're all there to share enjoyment of this thing that we love, whatever it is, whether it's Doctor Who, whether it's Harry Potter, which has become very problematic. I will not deny it. As a huge Potterhead, I am like, thank you, J.K. Rowling, for just like totally ruining the entire thing. Thanks so
I
much.
know.
It's really frustrating. Um, so like, you just don't get that with contemporary fiction or contemporary television that is, mimicking the world back at us. I will give one example actually. The show La Brea, which is which I watch because I like one of the actors, but it's not a great show. It's okay. Um, but they have the whole premise is like the cast has gotten sucked back in time to 10,000 BC. Totally unrealistic, obviously, but they have a character who is an amputee, and the actress who plays her is actually an amputee. And it's like, why do we have to watch a show with dinosaurs to get representation of our community? And I'm not saying there hasn't been representation in the past, because a lot of people will come at me and be like, well, what about, I don't know, there was some show in the 70s about a blind cop. I don't know. It was before my time. Um, what about this? What about that? And I'm like, okay, but it's 2024. Why are you going back almost 50 years to bring up an example of representation?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and there are so few and far between that where we can name them all. We
Yeah.
remember what they are because well, there's only a handful of example to pick up from, and it's
Mm-hmm.
so rare that is remarkable, right? Like
Exactly.
when it's no longer going to be remarkable that you have an amputee and a Peloton commercial, then we will have really made the progress that we are after. When it will be a
Right.
non-event, right? It's still an event. It's
Exactly.
still a thing. Oh, look, right? Because
Yeah.
because it's not the norm. It's still something that
Exactly.
is worth remarking upon because it's not the norm. Like no one say, look, there's a white guy in that commercial, right? Like it's just like
Yeah.
it's just what it is, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that I really loved about your TEDx is because it was almost like a simple guide, steps to
Mm-hmm.
allyship. And I know whether it's companies and brands or individuals, there are a few people out there that are well intentioned and perhaps are trying and willing to effect some of the changes that we are talking about. So
Mm-hmm.
Can you give us again that simple guide to how to be a better ally?
Um, well, I think the primary thing is when it comes to disabled issues, let disabled people lead. You know, no, I'm not gonna go to a white dude to be like, so tell me about the black experience in America. It makes no sense. I mean, sure, there are white people who have studied the black experience in America and they have a rudimentary sort of educational, informational understanding of it, but they don't know it. They don't, it's not ingrained. So why would I ask a non disabled person, tell me about the disabled experience in America? Because they don't know. And I mean, I've had arguments with people mostly on social media because I like to feed the trolls occasionally. um, they'll be like, "Well, I work with disabled people, so I know." And they've never said XYZ. And I just had to like, first of all, caregiver abuse to the disabled community is a thing. Like it's a issue. If you are in a position of some kind of authority when you say you work with disabled people, you're probably not going to hear it because they might be in a position where they're afraid to speak up. And so of course you're not going to hear it. You're not going to hear them tell you that the word handicapped is outdated and offensive because they don't want to make a problem for themselves. Um, and I think that's a big issue is people will, so few people are actually willing to listen and take on board what you say to them if it doesn't mesh with what they already believe. And I mean, I think I think to some extent that's true of everyone. Um, you know, Sometimes someone will say something to me that doesn't mesh with what I already believe to be true, and my instinct is to be like, well, wait a minute, no, and then I have to go, well, hold on, let me work through that for a minute and see if my instinct is correct. Because sometimes your instinct is correct. Sometimes
Yeah.
you're like, you hear something and you're like, no, and that's correct. But you have to be willing to, you know, listen to what people say. Now, I will give this a caveat by saying there are some people who are so far out in left field that you can just be like, no, no, it's not,
Yeah.
no. Conspiracy theorists, and I just no. It's just an automatic no. Um, but you know, really, let disabled people lead. If you have questions about disabled issues, ask a disabled person. And not every disabled person is going to tell you the same thing. Um, we always say, things like sexuality and gender identity and whatnot, they're on a spectrum because they're so fluid. Disability is the same way. It's on a spectrum. There is no one way to be disabled. And things that I need, accommodations or what have you, are not necessarily going to be what someone else needs. Even if we have the same condition, even if, um, like I worked with a woman once whose daughter actually turned out to also have OI, but our situations were very different. The woman actually told me one day, she was like, I didn't even know you had OI because there are physical attributes to having OI that, can sort of mark you as having it. And I don't really fit the profile. So I mean, we had the same condition. We were in a few years of age of each other, but our needs were totally different. So So don't just listen to one disabled person. I say it in my podcast, I said it in my TED talk. Disability is not a monolith. I am one voice for the disabled community, but I am not the only voice. And there are so many people who are willing, to answer your questions if they're brought up respectfully, if you're approached correctly. Don't go up to somebody in the grocery store and be like, "Hey, what's wrong with you?" Like that's happened to me. Not as much now that I'm an adult, but definitely as a kid. Kids have no filter. Um,
Indeed.
but I mean, I think for the most part, disabled people are willing to answer questions if they are approached correctly, you know, and you can't demand answers. You're not entitled to answers just because you ask politely. No is a full sentence. Disabled people do not have to share their medical history with you. Like, we don't have to tell you how we have sex. Like, the absolute entitlement some disabled people have, or non disabled people have, to the private lives of disabled people is insane. It is just insane. So, I mean, let disabled people lead, but also when you let them lead, you have to let them lead. You know what I mean? Like, you can't let them lead and then be like, "Oh no, we're going to do it this way. We want you to go this direction." No, you have to let them lead. You have to let them tell you what the issue is, how it can be corrected, um, and it might make you uncomfortable, especially if they say, "You know what? You saying this was a real problem, or you doing this was a real problem." Um, and you have to be willing to accept that criticism, and you have to do it in a way that makes disabled people feel safe, because, like I said, caregiver abuse is a thing, and disabled people are vulnerable. You know, they don't always have the ability to physically defend themselves. Um, they don't always have the ability to leave a situation. Um, I'm pretty lucky. I'm fairly strong. I could probably defend myself if I had to. Um, or at least, hit someone somewhere vulnerable. Um, but a lot of disabled people don't have that luxury. And I think you have to be cognizant of that if you're going to work with disabled people, because if they feel unsafe, nothing is going to change.
Yeah. Well, I think we are probably coming toward the end of this conversation, and I wanted
Okay.
to end on a question around this idea of reality. You talked about how excited you are about science fiction because it challenges what we consider reality to be, right? It
Mm-hmm.
challenges and break all the rules and the norms of our perception of reality. Um, how excited then, or are you excited about AR, VR, the metaverse, and all those pieces?
VR, I think, is really cool. It's not something I've experienced personally, but I think it could be really cool. Like, I don't necessarily think it should be a replacement for actual interaction, but a lot of disabled people do not have the ability to get out and interact. And this, we talk all the time about the dangers of social media and how people don't connect. But for disabled people who don't have the ability to get out and connect in real life, social media, the internet is a huge boon, because they can make these connections. They can make friends with people who understand, what they're going through. I bring up a lot, I'm old, so I grew up in like the late 80s and the 90s. Um, and one thing we didn't have then, we didn't have social media. So there was no way for my parents really to seek out other parents who were going through something similar, and B, connect me with other kids. So I didn't meet my first disabled kid, like peer, until I was 11. Like, I had interacted a little bit with other disabled people, but it wasn't someone who was on my level. It wasn't a potential friend, and she actually did become a good friend. Um, so I think there's a lot of potential for VR in that way. Now, AI is a little bit trickier because I have seen a lot of really good uses of AI, especially for disabled people. I saw a story about a woman. She's paralyzed and she regained her ability to speak through AI, which
Wow.
I was like, that's great. As an artist who has seen this huge spike in people passing off AI art, and I
Mm,
mean, I use the term loosely, AI art, as their own work, as, a viable option. Like, it can be really detrimental to creative people. Now I have a friend who's a writer, and she uses AI to help her because it takes a lot of energy for her to write. It just does. So she uses AI to sort of create the foundation, and then she builds upon it,
mm-hmm.
and it's fine. Like, that's, because she changes it. It's not She's not passing off the AI text as her work.
Yeah.
She's not going, "Oh, I typed in this prompt and look what it made and I'm an artist." You know, like so many people are doing, and it's really detrimental to the art community. It's gotten to the point where a lot of like art groups I'm in on Facebook, they will ban AI art if you show something that's AI, unless it's in the context of, how do I know this is AI, or I found this AI wherever. um, they'll ban you because, you know the way that the AI has been trained with art specifically is by taking information from art other people have put out there, and as an artist, the only way to get people to interact with your art is to show them your art. You can't not show it to them. You can't not share it. And I mean, and now recently we have had um there have been some improvements in ways to protect what you share, but all the art that has been shared up, let's call the mid 90s the real synthesis of the internet. So for the last 30 years, all the thousands of artists who have shared their art on social media, on sites like DeviantArt, you know, they're pulling from all of this. There's no way to go back and protect it.
Yeah.
And there's no way you can't remove it. Once it's online, it's there forever.
Yeah.
So AI is a very contentious subject for me because I
Yeah.
see the potential. I really see the potential for it to do a lot of good, but I also see the potential for it to be really, really harmful to a particular subset of people.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think this is probably everyone's relationship with AI at the moment, right? Like you are hopeful and optimistic about all the wonderful things that it can do, but we are all painfully aware of the dark side, and we know how slowly laws usually move in relationship to
Mhm.
technology. So
Well, you just have to look at what just happened with Taylor Swift. You know, people making these deep fake, and like I'm not like a huge Taylor Swift fan. Like I'm not like over here just losing my mind because Taylor Swift got doxxed or whatever. But I mean, that's so dangerous because I mean, they took completely fabricated images. It wasn't even like, like in the past we've had celebrities get hacked and their nude photos were released. But this was not that. This was not a hacking. This was completely fabricated from scratch. And like when you think about how people use revenge porn,
mhm,
like it's so scary. Especially as a woman. It's so
yeah,
scary because those tools are available online for free. Like they did a whole news story about it. Like you don't even have to pay to ruin someone's life, and only because Taylor Swift is who she is was she able to get in front of it and like, now you can't even search her name on Twitter or whatever it's called now.
yeah,
Um so I mean, for the average person, there is no recourse.
yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, yeah, I share your optimism, your fearful optimism, careful
Mhm.
optimism about
Yep.
AI. I got really excited about the metaverse and all the prospects there, but of course there too, there are some worries to be had. But
Yeah.
Laura, we are at the end of this conversation. I am always so inspired by people that use their voice to raise issues and to speak for those who do not have a voice, because I recognize in myself at times how fearful I am to speak up when I know I should, when I know I could use my
Mhm.
platform and my voice to address issues, and I cower and I'm scared, and so every time I see someone who does it, I'm always so inspired, and it allows me to be a little bit braver whenever I have the opportunity to do the same. So I just wanted to thank you for all the work that you do, your advocacy for all the issues that you bring to life. Um, Thank you so much for being on the show. I hope this is not the last conversation that we have and the last interaction. There is still so much to talk about, and I'm looking
Absolutely.
forward for our relationship to continue to grow and blossom. Thank you so much.
I appreciate it. I've really enjoyed it. So it's been a really good conversation. I've really enjoyed it.